They looked at her like she was lost, like she'd wandered into the wrong building by mistake. Just another middle-aged woman in thrift store jeans and sneakers that had seen better days. No corporate badge, no designer laptop bag, no hint that she belonged among the tech elite gathering for the most exclusive cybersecurity summit in the country. The security team exchanged glances when she approached the registration desk, their smirks barely concealed behind professional facades. They had no idea what was embedded beneath the skin of her left wrist, no clue about the classified technology that would make their scanning equipment light up like a Christmas tree if they bothered to look close enough. They had no idea who Maya Chen really was, or why everything was about to change the moment that tiny piece of government hardware revealed itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maya felt the familiar weight of being underestimated settle around her shoulders like an old coat as she stepped through the automatic glass doors of tech-secure corporate headquarters. The Phoenix sun blazed overhead, turning the asphalt parking lot into a shimmering lake of heat. But inside the building, the air conditioning created an Arctic environment that made her grateful for the lightweight cardigan she'd thrown over her plain white t-shirt. The lobby stretched out before her, all polished marble floors and soaring glass walls that reflected the desert landscape beyond, a monument to corporate success that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who didn't belong to the inner circle of Silicon Valley royalty. She paused just inside the entrance, letting her eyes adjust to the dramatically cooler environment while she took in the controlled chaos surrounding her. Hundreds of conference attendees moved through the space with the purposeful energy of people who believed their work was changing the world. Men in perfectly tailored suits spoke in urgent whispers into wireless earpieces, their voices carrying the authority that came with seven-figure budgets and government contracts. Women in designer blazers and shoes that cost more than Maya's monthly rent clicked across the marble with the confidence of executives who had never been told they didn't belong anywhere. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going, exactly who they needed to see, exactly how important they were supposed to be. Maya looked down at her own reflection in the polished floor and almost smiled. She had chosen her outfit carefully this morning, selecting each piece for its ability to render her invisible among this crowd. The jeans were clean but worn, bought from a discount retailer 3 years ago and showing their age in the way the fabric had softened and faded. Her sneakers were white canvas, practical and unremarkable, the kind of shoes worn by someone who stood on their feet all day at a job that didn't require impressing anyone. The cardigan was navy blue, shapeless enough to hide the lean muscle definition in her arms that might have suggested something more than a sedentary office worker. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, held with an elastic band that had cost 99 cents at a drugstore. No jewelry except for a basic digital watch with a cracked face, no makeup beyond a touch of lip balm, no accessories that might catch someone's eye or suggest she had money to spend on anything beyond necessities. It was a carefully constructed facade of ordinariness, and it worked exactly as intended. As she moved deeper into the lobby, conversations continued around her without pause, important people discussing important things without bothering to lower their voices in her presence. She was furniture to them, background noise, a person so clearly outside their sphere of influence that she might as well have been invisible. The irony wasn't lost on her that invisibility had been her greatest professional asset for nearly 15 years, though the stakes had been considerably higher than hurt feelings at a corporate conference. The registration area occupied the far end of the lobby, a series of sleek black tables staffed by young professionals in matching tech-secure polo shirts, who checked badges and handed out conference materials with practiced efficiency. Maya joined the line behind a group of venture capitalists who were debating the merits of investing in quantum encryption startups. Their conversation peppered with technical terms they clearly didn't fully understand, but delivered with the confidence of people who never doubted their own expertise. She listened with half her attention while scanning the security setup, noting the placement of cameras, the configuration of access control points, the positioning of uniformed guards who watched the crowd with the bored vigilance of people who expected nothing more exciting than a lost conference attendee or a vendor trying to sneak into restricted areas. Her gaze lingered on the security station positioned between the registration tables and the elevator bank that led to the upper floors where the real conference activities would take place. 3 guards staffed the checkpoint, scanning badges and checking identification with the thoroughness of airport security. The technology was impressive even by her standards. Biometric scanners that read fingerprints and retinal patterns, metal detectors sensitive enough to identify the specific composition of any metallic objects, and what appeared to be some kind of millimeter wave imaging system that could detect concealed electronics or weapons beneath clothing. It was exactly the kind of comprehensive security apparatus she would have expected from a company that held contracts with multiple government agencies and claimed to protect the digital infrastructure of half the Fortune 500. The line moved forward with agonizing slowness, each conference attendee spending several minutes at the registration table while their credentials were verified against multiple databases, and their conference packages were assembled with ceremonial attention to detail. Maya found herself studying the other people in line, noting the subtle hierarchies that revealed themselves in posture and clothing choices. The senior executives carried themselves with the unconscious arrogance of people who had never been denied access to anything they wanted, their shoulders square and their gazes direct as they surveyed the crowd for networking opportunities. The mid-level managers clustered in small groups, their conversations just loud enough to demonstrate their importance to anyone within earshot. The junior staff and researchers kept their heads down, focused on their phones or tablets, trying to blend into the background while absorbing everything around them. Maya recognized the dynamics because she'd spent years moving through similar environments, though the stakes had usually involved national security rather than corporate advancement. She'd learned to read rooms full of powerful people, to identify the decision-makers and the gatekeepers, to understand the unspoken rules that governed access and acceptance. The skills translated surprisingly well to the civilian world, even if the consequences of miscalculation were generally limited to professional embarrassment rather than international incidents. When she finally reached the registration table, the young woman behind it looked up with the kind of smile that managed to be both professional and dismissive. Her name tag identified her as Lisa Thompson, conference coordinator, and her expression suggested she was already categorizing Maya as someone who probably didn't belong, but would need to be handled with polite efficiency nonetheless. "Good morning," Lisa said, her tone bright but carefully neutral. "Welcome to the TechSecure Cybersecurity Summit. Do you have your confirmation number?" Maya reached into the small crossbody bag she carried and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the kind of printout that suggested she either didn't own a smartphone or didn't know how to use the conference app that everyone else seemed to be consulting. The paper was slightly wrinkled, as if it had been stored in a purse for several days, and the print quality suggested a home printer that was running low on ink. She handed it across the table with the slightly apologetic air of someone who knew she was probably doing something wrong but wasn't sure what. "I think this is what you need," Maya said, her voice carrying just a hint of uncertainty that suggested she didn't attend many professional conferences and wasn't entirely sure about the protocol. Lisa took the paper and scanned it quickly, her eyebrows drawing together in concentration as she cross-referenced the information against her computer screen. The confusion that flickered across her face was subtle but unmistakable, the expression of someone encountering data that didn't quite match her expectations. "Maya Chen," Lisa read aloud, pronouncing the name carefully, as if she wasn't entirely sure she had it right. "It says here you're registered for full conference access, including the restricted sessions." She looked up, her professional smile wavering slightly. "Are you sure this is correct? Some of those sessions require pretty high-level security clearances." The question hung in the air, with the weight of polite skepticism, the kind of challenge that suggested Lisa was doing Maya a favor by giving her the opportunity to correct what was obviously a mistake before it became embarrassing. Maya felt the familiar flutter of amusement that came from being so thoroughly underestimated, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times when targets assumed she was nothing more than a confused tourist or a lost office worker. "I believe it's correct," Maya replied, maintaining the same slightly uncertain tone, "though I have to admit I'm not entirely sure what some of those sessions involve. Technology moves so fast these days." Lisa's smile became more genuine, the warmth of someone who recognized a kindred spirit struggling with the complexities of the modern world. "Oh, I know exactly what you mean. Sometimes I feel like I need a computer science degree just to understand my own conference schedule." She turned back to her screen, fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. "Let me just verify a few things and get you set up with your materials." Maya waited patiently while Lisa worked, aware that her registration was probably generating more questions than usual. She'd specifically requested access to the highest-level sessions, the ones that required government clearances and involved discussions of classified technologies. On paper, her credentials looked legitimate enough to pass automated verification systems, but they would inevitably raise eyebrows when reviewed by human staff who were trained to spot inconsistencies and anomalies. The truth was that her access had been arranged through channels that existed outside normal conference registration procedures, the kind of backdoor authorization that required favors from people who owed other people favors. Dr. Patricia Hayes, TechSecure's chief technology officer, had personally ensured that Maya's name appeared on the restricted access list, though they hadn't spoken directly in over 3 years, and Hayes probably assumed Maya would never actually use the invitation. "Everything seems to be in order," Lisa said finally, though her tone suggested she was still puzzled by something. "Your badge will give you access to all conference areas, including the R&D demonstration labs on the 15th floor. Just a heads up though, security up there is pretty intense. They'll scan your badge multiple times and probably ask for additional identification." She assembled Maya's conference packet with practiced efficiency, sliding a glossy folder across the table along with a badge holder and lanyard that identified Maya as a special access attendee, in letters that seemed designed to draw attention rather than deflect it. The badge itself was heavier than the standard conference credentials. Embedded, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, with multiple security chips and printed on material that would be difficult to counterfeit. "Thank you," Maya said, accepting the materials with the grateful air of someone who appreciated help navigating an unfamiliar environment. "I really appreciate your patience. This is all quite overwhelming." Lisa's expression softened further, convinced that she was dealing with someone who was clearly out of their depth but trying their best to keep up. "Don't worry about it at all. The first day is always a bit chaotic. If you need any help finding the session rooms or have questions about the schedule, just ask any of the TechSecure staff. We're here to help." Maya thanked her again and stepped away from the registration table, clipping the badge to her cardigan with the careful attention of someone who didn't want to damage the expensive-looking credential. As she moved toward the security checkpoint, she could feel Lisa's eyes following her, probably wondering how someone who seemed so technologically challenged had ended up with access to some of the most sensitive presentations at the conference. The security line moved more quickly than registration, but the scrutiny was considerably more intense. Maya watched the people ahead of her submit to multiple scans and checks, noting how the guards examined each badge under specialized readers that presumably verified the embedded security features. The process reminded her of classified facilities she'd visited during her government service, though the technology here was actually more advanced than some of the systems she'd encountered in supposedly secure installations. When her turn came, Maya stepped up to the first scanning station with the slightly nervous energy of someone who wasn't entirely sure what was expected of her. The guard behind the counter was a middle-aged man whose name tag identified him as Mike Stevens, and his expression suggested he'd been doing this job long enough to spot trouble from across the room. "Badge and identification, please," Stevens said, extending his hand with the mechanical precision of someone who'd repeated the same request hundreds of times that day. Maya handed over her conference badge and reached into her bag for her driver's license, movements deliberately careful to avoid any gestures that might be interpreted as suspicious or threatening. The license was genuine, issued by the state of Arizona under her real name, though it listed an address for an apartment she'd given up 2 years earlier. Stevens examined both documents under a specialized reader that presumably checked for forgeries or alterations, his eyes moving between the screens and Maya's face with professional thoroughness. "First time at a TechSecure event?" he asked, the question casual but clearly designed to gather additional information about her background and intentions. "Yes," Maya replied, injecting just enough nervousness into her voice to suggest someone who was intimidated by the security process. "I'm not really sure what to expect. This is all quite impressive." Stevens nodded, his expression neutral as he processed her badge through multiple scanners. Maya watched the screens over his shoulder, noting the various security indicators that flashed green as each verification step completed successfully. Whatever Patricia Hayes had done to arrange her access, it had been thorough enough to satisfy even this level of scrutiny. "You're cleared for restricted areas," Stevens observed, his tone suggesting mild surprise. "That's not common for first-time attendees. Must be important work you're involved in." The comment was delivered with the practiced neutrality of someone fishing for information without seeming to pry, the kind of conversational probe that might reveal useful details about a visitor's background or intentions. Maya recognized the technique because she'd used it herself countless times, though usually in considerably more dangerous circumstances. "I'm not entirely sure how important it is," she replied, maintaining her cover of technological confusion. "Someone thought I should attend, but honestly, a lot of this is over my head. I'm hoping to learn something useful." Stevens handed back her credentials with a slight smile that suggested he found her honesty refreshing in a crowd of people who were probably overselling their own expertise. "Well, you've got access to some pretty high-level presentations. Should be quite an education." Maya accepted her badge and moved toward the metal detector, aware that she was about to encounter the first real test of her carefully planned approach to this event. Hidden beneath the skin of her left wrist, just below the surface and invisible to casual observation, was a piece of technology that would fundamentally change how these security professionals viewed her if they discovered it. The microchip was smaller than a grain of rice, virtually undetectable without specialized scanning equipment, but it contained enough encrypted data to prove that everything about her carefully constructed ordinary appearance was an elaborate deception. The technology itself was a marvel of miniaturization and encryption, developed by a classified research program that few people even knew existed. The chip contained biometric verification data, security clearances, and access codes that would identify her to anyone with the proper reading equipment, as someone whose background and capabilities were far beyond what her appearance suggested. It was the kind of credential that couldn't be faked, couldn't be stolen, and couldn't be explained away as a misunderstanding or administrative error. Maya had been carrying the chip for so long that she'd almost forgotten it was there, a small weight beneath her skin that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. She'd received it during her final assignment with the NSA's Tailored Access Operations Unit, back when her work involved infiltrating foreign networks and extracting intelligence that officially didn't exist. The chip had been her insurance policy, a way to prove her identity and clearance level if she ever found herself in a situation where normal channels of communication had been compromised. She'd never expected to need it again after leaving government service, but the events of the past 6 months had convinced her that some threats required the kind of response that only someone with her particular skills could provide. The TechSecure Summit represented an opportunity to gather intelligence about emerging cybersecurity threats, the kind of information that wasn't available through public channels or academic conferences. If her suspicions were correct, some of the technologies being demonstrated here posed risks that extended far beyond corporate espionage or financial fraud. The metal detector scanned her body with methodical precision, its sensors designed to identify any metallic objects that might represent security threats. Maya stood motionless, with her arms slightly raised, aware that the chip in her wrist was probably too small to trigger any alarms, but also knowing that the more sophisticated scanning equipment ahead might tell a different story. "You're all set," the guard operating the metal detector announced, waving her through toward the next checkpoint. Maya collected her bag from the X-ray machine and moved toward the final security station, where a more advanced scanning system waited to perform what the signs described as enhanced screening for restricted access attendees. The equipment looked like something from a science fiction movie, a cylindrical chamber surrounded by displays and control panels that probably cost more than most people's houses. The guard at this station was younger than Stevens, a woman whose name tag identified her as Rachel Wong and whose demeanor suggested someone who took her responsibilities very seriously. She gestured for Maya to step into the scanning chamber with the confidence of someone who had complete faith in her equipment's ability to detect any concealed threats or unauthorized materials. "This is just a routine enhanced scan," Wong explained, her voice professional but not unfriendly. "It'll take about 30 seconds and you won't feel anything. Just stand still and keep your arms at your sides." Maya stepped into the chamber, feeling the familiar flutter of anticipation that always preceded moments when her carefully constructed cover might be challenged. The scanner activated with a soft humming sound, invisible energy washing over her body as sensors analyzed everything from her bone density to the composition of the metal in her watch band. She could see Wong watching the displays intently, her expression focused on the data streaming across multiple screens. For several seconds, everything proceeded normally. The scanner identified her watch, her keys, the metal rivets in her jeans, and the underwire in her bra with clinical precision. Maya watched Wong's face for any sign that the equipment had detected something unusual, but the guard's expression remained neutral and professional. Then one of the displays flickered, a subtle change in the color of one indicator that caught Wang's attention. Maya saw her lean forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied the readout more carefully. The scanner completed its cycle and powered down, but Wang continued to stare at the screen, her expression puzzled. "Is everything all right?" Maya asked, injecting just enough concern into her voice to suggest someone who was worried about being delayed rather than someone who was concerned about discovery. Wang looked up, her expression thoughtful. "Yeah, just probably nothing. The scanner picked up something metallic in your left arm, but it's so small it's probably just a piece of jewelry or maybe old surgical hardware. Do you have any implants or previous injuries in that area?" Maya felt her pulse quicken slightly, though she kept her expression calm and slightly confused. This was the moment she'd been preparing for, the point where her ordinary appearance would either hold up under scrutiny or begin to unravel in ways that could complicate everything she was trying to accomplish. "I had a pretty bad break in my wrist a few years ago," she said, rolling up her sleeve to reveal the faint scar that marked where the chip had been inserted. "They had to put in some screws and pins to hold everything together. Is that going to be a problem?" Wang studied the scar, which was genuine enough, though it had nothing to do with any broken bones. The mark was barely visible, a thin line that could easily be explained by any number of minor surgical procedures. Maya held her arm steady, letting the guard examine the area while maintaining the patient air of someone who was used to explaining old injuries to curious security personnel. "No, that should be fine," Wang said finally, though she made a note on her screen that would probably be flagged for review later. Sometimes the scanner picks up surgical hardware and flags it as potentially suspicious. Sorry for the delay. Maya rolled her sleeve back down and accepted her visitor badge with a grateful smile, stepping away from the security checkpoint with the relief of someone who had successfully navigated an unfamiliar and potentially intimidating process. As she moved toward the elevator bank, she could feel Wang's eyes following her, probably wondering if she should have investigated the scanner reading more thoroughly. The elevator ride to the main conference floor gave Maya a few moments to process what had just happened and prepare for the next phase of her carefully planned infiltration. The security scanning had revealed the presence of the chip, but the guards had accepted her explanation without demanding additional verification. It was exactly the kind of response she'd hoped for. Enough scrutiny to demonstrate that the security was genuine, but not enough investigation to reveal what the chip actually contained. As the elevator climbed toward the 15th floor, Maya allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. Phase 1 was complete. She'd successfully gained access to the most secure areas of the conference without raising any serious suspicions about her identity or here in the first place, and gathering the intelligence she needed to assess their potential impact. The elevator doors opened to reveal a corridor that looked like something from a high-tech thriller, all brushed intentions. Now came the more challenging part, identifying the specific threats that had brought her steel surfaces and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered sweeping views of the Phoenix skyline. Conference attendees moved through the space with the purposeful energy of people engaged in important work, their conversations carried out in the hushed tones appropriate for discussions of classified technologies and sensitive business intelligence. Maya stepped out of the elevator and began walking down the corridor, studying the directory signs that indicated various presentation rooms and demonstration areas. Her badge would give her access to any of the sessions listed on her itinerary, but she was particularly interested in the restricted demonstrations that were taking place in the secure labs at the far end of the floor. She was halfway down the corridor when she heard footsteps behind her, the measured pace of someone who was deliberately trying to catch up without appearing to hurry. Maya glanced over her shoulder and saw a young man in an expensive suit approaching, his expression suggesting someone who had recognized her from somewhere but couldn't quite place where they might have met. "Excuse me," he said as he drew closer, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who was used to having his questions answered. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I couldn't help noticing your badge. You're cleared for the classified demonstrations?" Maya turned to face him fully, taking in his appearance with the automatic assessment that had become second nature during her years in intelligence work. He was probably in his early 30s, well-groomed in the way that suggested significant disposable income, and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never seriously doubted his own importance. His suit was tailored perfectly, his shoes were handmade Italian leather, and his watch was the kind of status symbol that cost more than most people's cars. "I believe so," Maya replied, maintaining her cover of technological uncertainty, "though I'm not entirely sure what that means. Someone arranged my access, but I'm still trying to figure out exactly what I'm supposed to be doing here." The young man extended his hand with a practiced smile that managed to be both friendly and calculating. Kevin Park, Senior Analyst with Digital Fortress Solutions. "I've been coming to these conferences for years, and I have to say, I'm impressed. Those clearances are usually reserved for people with pretty serious government connections." Maya shook his hand, noting the firmness of his grip and the way his eyes studied her face as if he was trying to memorize her features for later reference. Kevin Park was clearly someone who made it his business to know who was who in the cybersecurity world, and her appearance at the conference with high-level access had obviously caught his attention. "Maya Chen," she replied, offering only her name without any additional context that might satisfy his curiosity about her background or affiliations. "Are you with one of the government agencies?" Kevin pressed, his tone casual but his interest clearly genuine. "Or maybe one of the defense contractors? I thought I knew most of the regular attendees, but I don't think we've met before." Maya could feel the conversation moving into territory that would require increasingly elaborate deceptions if she wanted to maintain her cover. Kevin Park was obviously someone who was well connected within the industry, the kind of person who might have access to information that could expose inconsistencies in her carefully constructed background. She needed to end this interaction before he became suspicious enough to start asking more pointed questions. "I'm not really sure I'm supposed to discuss that," she said, injecting a note of uncertainty into her voice that suggested someone who was nervous about revealing information she might not be authorized to share. "This is all quite new to me, and I don't want to say something I shouldn't." Kevin's expression shifted slightly, his eyes sharpening with the interest of someone who had just heard something that didn't quite add up. Maya recognized the look because she'd seen it countless times before, the moment when an intelligent person began to suspect that the person they were talking to wasn't entirely what they seemed to be. "Of course," he said, though his tone suggested he was filing away her response for later consideration. "Well, I hope you find the presentations useful. Some of the technologies being demonstrated this week are really cutting-edge stuff." Maya thanked him and continued down the corridor, aware that Kevin Park was still watching her as she walked away. The encounter had been brief and superficially friendly, but it represented exactly the kind of complication she'd hoped to avoid. People like Kevin made it their business to understand the power structures and relationships within their industry, and her presence as an unknown quantity with high-level access would inevitably generate questions that could become problematic if pursued too aggressively. She found the entrance to the secure demonstration area at the end of the corridor, marked by another security checkpoint that was even more sophisticated than the one in the lobby. This time, the scanning equipment included biometric readers that verified fingerprints and retinal patterns against government databases, the kind of technology that would make it difficult for anyone without legitimate credentials to gain access. Maya approached the checkpoint with the same careful uncertainty she'd displayed throughout the morning, aware that this would be her final test before gaining access to the information she'd come here to gather. If her credentials were going to be challenged, this was where it would happen. If the security systems detected anything suspicious about her background or her embedded chip, this was where her carefully planned infiltration would begin to unravel. But as she presented her badge to the guard and submitted to the various scans and checks, everything proceeded smoothly. The biometric readers confirmed her identity, the security systems verified her clearance level, and within minutes, she was being waved through to the secure areas where the real secrets of the conference were waiting to be revealed. Maya stepped through the final security door and found herself in a corridor that looked like something from a classified government facility, all reinforced walls and surveillance cameras, and the kind of absolute silence that suggested conversations here were conducted at whisper level. At the far end of the hallway, she could see the entrance to the demonstration lab where some of the most sensitive presentations of the conference were scheduled to take place. She was almost there, almost to the point where she could begin gathering the intelligence that had brought her across the country under an assumed identity. But as she walked down that final corridor, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed anonymity was already beginning to slip away, that people like Kevin Park were asking questions that would eventually lead to answers she wasn't prepared to provide. The next few hours would determine whether her mission succeeded or whether her past would catch up with her in ways that could compromise everything she was trying to accomplish. Either way, there was no turning back now. The game had begun, and Maya Chen was committed to playing it through to whatever conclusion awaited her in the secure labs of Tech Secure corporate headquarters. The secure demonstration lab buzzed with the kind of controlled energy that only existed in rooms where classified technologies were being unveiled to people who held the appropriate clearances. Maya stepped through the reinforced glass doors and immediately felt the weight of scrutiny from the dozen or so conference attendees who had already gathered around various display stations. These weren't the networking-focused executives from the main conference floor. These were the serious players, the people whose work directly impacted national security and whose presence here represented millions of dollars in government contracts and classified research initiatives. Maya moved slowly along the perimeter of the room, taking in the sophisticated equipment displays while maintaining her carefully crafted persona of someone who was overwhelmed by the technical complexity surrounding her. The demonstrations included next-generation encryption systems, quantum computing applications for cryptographic analysis, and artificial intelligence platforms designed to detect and neutralize cyber threats in real time. Each station was staffed by engineers and researchers who spoke in the shorthand of experts communicating with their peers, their conversations peppered with acronyms and technical specifications that would be meaningless to anyone without deep specialized knowledge. She paused at a display showcasing advanced network penetration tools, studying the sleek interface of a system that claimed to identify vulnerabilities in secured networks within minutes of initial contact. The technology was impressive even by her standards, representing the kind of advancement that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in cyber warfare. As she leaned closer to read the technical specifications, Maya became aware of someone approaching from her left, footsteps deliberate and purposeful, in a way that suggested official business rather than casual curiosity. "Excuse me, miss." The voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, crisp consonants, and measured cadence that immediately identified the speaker as either military or law enforcement. Maya turned to find herself facing a man in his early 40s, whose bearing screamed federal agent even without the obvious bulge of a concealed weapon beneath his perfectly tailored suit jacket. His dark hair was regulation short, his shoes were polished to mirror brightness, and his eyes held the particular alertness of someone whose job required constant awareness of potential threats. "Yes?" Maya replied, injecting just enough uncertainty into her voice to suggest someone who was nervous about being singled out by what was obviously a person of authority. The man's gaze swept over her appearance with professional thoroughness, taking in every detail from her discount store cardigan to her worn sneakers, with the methodical attention of someone trained to assess potential security risks. His expression shifted subtly as he processed what he was seeing, eyebrows drawing together in the kind of confusion that suggested he was encountering something that didn't match his expectations. "I'm Brad Winters, head of security for Tech Secure," he said, producing a badge wallet that he flipped open just long enough for Maya to glimpse his photograph and official credentials before snapping it closed again. "I need to verify your authorization to be in this area. This is a restricted demonstration lab, and access is limited to personnel with appropriate government clearances." Maya reached into her crossbody bag with deliberately careful movements, aware that any gesture that might be interpreted as sudden or threatening would immediately escalate the situation in ways that could compromise her mission. She produced her conference badge and handed it to Winters with the apologetic air of someone who hoped she hadn't somehow violated protocols she didn't fully understand. "I think this should cover it," she said, maintaining her cover of technological confusion. "Though I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure what level of clearance I'm supposed to have for different areas. This is all quite complicated." Winters examined her badge under a handheld scanner that presumably verified the embedded security features, his expression growing more puzzled as the device confirmed her credentials. Maya watched his face carefully, noting the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was encountering information that didn't align with his assumptions about who should have access to this level of classified material. "Maya Chen," he read aloud, pronouncing her name with the careful precision of someone who wanted to be absolutely certain he had it correct. "It says here you're cleared for all restricted demonstrations, including the quantum encryption protocols and the autonomous threat response systems." He looked up, his gaze moving over her appearance again with obvious skepticism. "Can you tell me what organization you're affiliated with?" The question was delivered with the neutral professionalism of someone conducting a routine security verification, But Maya could hear the underlying suspicion that suggested Winters was beginning to doubt whether her presence here was legitimate. She recognized the tone because she'd used it herself countless times when interrogating subjects whose stories didn't quite add up under closer examination. "I'm not entirely sure I'm supposed to discuss that," Maya replied, echoing the same response she'd given Kevin Park earlier, but with slightly more nervousness to suggest someone who was genuinely uncertain about security protocols rather than someone who was deliberately avoiding the question. "I was told to attend these demonstrations, but nobody really explained what I was supposed to say about my background or affiliations." Winter's expression shifted from skepticism to something approaching alarm, the look of a security professional who was beginning to suspect he might be dealing with a more serious problem than a simple administrative error. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to the kind of confidential whisper used for sensitive conversations in public spaces. "Ma'am, I need you to understand that this is a secure facility hosting classified government demonstrations," he said, his tone carrying the weight of someone who was accustomed to having his concerns taken seriously. "If you're not certain about your authorization or your security status, we need to resolve that immediately. I can't have unauthorized personnel accessing sensitive materials." Maya felt the familiar flutter of adrenaline that always accompanied moments when her cover story was being challenged by someone with the authority and resources to investigate her background thoroughly. Winters was clearly not the kind of person who would be satisfied with vague explanations or administrative confusion. If he decided to dig deeper into her credentials, he might uncover inconsistencies that could expose her true identity and compromise everything she was trying to accomplish. "Of course," she said, injecting genuine concern into her voice while maintaining her pose of cooperative confusion. "I certainly don't want to be anywhere I'm not supposed to be. Should I speak with someone from conference administration? I have the contact information for the person who arranged my attendance." Before Winters could respond, another voice interrupted their conversation from behind Maya's left shoulder. "Is there a problem here?" The tone was crisp and professional, carrying the authority of someone who was accustomed to being consulted when security issues arose. Maya turned to see a woman in her mid-50s approaching, her stride confident and purposeful, in a way that immediately marked her as someone important within the tech-secure hierarchy. She was dressed in a charcoal gray business suit that suggested serious money and serious responsibility, her silver hair cut in a style that was both professional and elegant. Her eyes were sharp with intelligence and carried the particular alertness of someone whose work required making critical decisions under pressure. "Dr. Hayes," Winters said, straightening slightly in a way that suggested respect for rank and position. "I was just verifying this attendee's authorization for the restricted demonstrations. Her credentials check out, but she seems uncertain about her security status and organizational affiliations." Dr. Patricia Hayes studied Maya with the methodical attention of someone trained to assess technical problems and identify optimal solutions. Maya felt herself being evaluated not just as a potential security risk, but as a puzzle that needed to be solved. And she recognized the expression because she'd seen it countless times in the faces of analysts and researchers who approached every unknown variable as an intellectual challenge. "Maya Chen," Hayes said, reading the name from the badge that Winters was still holding. "That name is familiar." She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as she searched her memory for the context that would place Maya's identity. "Have we worked together before? Your name appears in some correspondence I've received, but I can't quite place the connection." Maya felt her pulse quicken as she realized that Hayes might actually recognize her name from professional contexts that predated her carefully constructed civilian identity. If Hayes had been involved in government cybersecurity projects during Maya's time with the NSA, there was a possibility that their paths had crossed in ways that could expose her background to exactly the kind of scrutiny she was trying to avoid. "I don't think we've met," Maya replied carefully, maintaining her cover while trying to gauge how much Hayes might actually know about her professional history. "Though it's possible my name has come up in some administrative context, I'm afraid I don't always keep track of where my information gets shared." Hayes continued to study her with the intense focus of someone who was convinced they were missing an important piece of information. Maya could practically see the mental gears turning as Hayes tried to place her in the appropriate professional context, and she found herself hoping that whatever records or correspondence Hayes was remembering were vague enough to avoid exposing her true background. "Well, regardless of where I've seen your name before, your credentials are clearly legitimate," Hayes said finally, though her tone suggested she was still puzzled by something she couldn't quite identify. "Mr. Winters, I think we can consider this matter resolved. Miss Chen is welcome to attend any of the demonstrations her clearance level permits." Winters looked like he wanted to pursue the matter further, his expression suggesting someone who wasn't entirely satisfied with the resolution but recognized that he'd been overruled by someone with greater authority. He handed Maya's badge back to her with obvious reluctance, his eyes still carrying the suspicion of someone who believed there were unanswered questions that deserved further investigation. "Thank you," Maya said, accepting her credentials with the grateful relief of someone who had been worried about being asked to leave. "I appreciate your patience. I know this must seem irregular." As Hayes and Winters moved away to continue their conversation in whispered tones that suggested ongoing concerns about security protocols, Maya became aware that their interaction had drawn attention from other attendees in the demonstration lab. Several people were glancing in her direction with expressions that ranged from idle curiosity to more focused interest, and she realized that her presence as an unknown quantity in this exclusive environment was beginning to generate exactly the kind of scrutiny she'd hoped to avoid. A small group of conference attendees had gathered near the quantum encryption display, their conversation apparently centered on the technical specifications of the demonstrated system, but their attention clearly divided between the technology and the unusual security consultation that had just taken place. Maya could hear fragments of their discussion as she moved past their position, words and phrases that suggested they were speculating about her identity and background. "Never seen her at any of the classified briefings," one voice observed, belonging to a middle-aged man whose expensive suit and confident posture marked him as someone with significant government connections. "Usually you know everyone who has access to this level of material. Maybe she's with one of the new contractors." Another voice suggested, this one belonging to a woman whose manner suggested extensive experience with classified projects. "There's been a lot of personnel shuffling lately with the budget reallocations." "Could be intelligence community," a third voice added, carrying the kind of knowing tone that suggested someone who considered themselves well-informed about the hidden structures of government security operations. "Those people don't exactly advertise their affiliations." Maya continued moving through the lab, stopping occasionally to examine various demonstrations while remaining acutely aware of the ongoing speculation about her presence. The conversations around her had taken on a different quality since her encounter with Winters, less focused on technical details and more concerned with identifying and categorizing the people who had access to these sensitive materials. She paused at a display showcasing artificial intelligence systems designed for autonomous network defense, studying the interface of a program that claimed to identify and neutralize cyber threats without human intervention. The technology represented exactly the kind of advancement that had brought her to this conference, the type of capability that could fundamentally alter the landscape of cyber warfare if it fell into the wrong hands. "Impressive system," a voice said from behind her, and Maya turned to find Kevin Park approaching with the same calculating smile he'd displayed during their earlier encounter in the corridor. "Though I have to wonder about the security implications of fully autonomous defensive systems. Seems like the kind of technology that could be problematic if someone figured out how to subvert the control mechanisms." Maya studied his expression, noting the way his eyes seemed to be evaluating her reaction to his comments with the attention of someone who was probing for information rather than making casual conversation. Kevin Park was clearly someone who made it his business to understand the technical and political implications of emerging cybersecurity technologies, and his interest in her responses suggested he was trying to gauge her level of expertise. "I hadn't really thought about that," Maya replied, maintaining her cover of technological uncertainty while carefully avoiding any response that might reveal her true understanding of the systems being demonstrated. "I suppose any computer system could potentially be compromised if someone was clever enough." Kevin's smile became more genuine, though there was still something calculating in his expression that suggested he was filing away her responses for later analysis. That's exactly the kind of thinking that makes these conferences valuable. It's easy to get caught up in what these systems can do, and forget to ask what happens if they don't work the way they're supposed to. Before Maya could respond, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another conference attendee, a tall man in his early 30s, whose bearing immediately marked him as military, despite his civilian clothes. His dark hair was regulation short, his posture was parade ground straight, and his eyes held the particular alertness of someone whose training had conditioned him to constantly assess potential threats and opportunities. "Excuse me for interrupting," the newcomer said, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to giving orders, and having them followed without question. I'm Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, attached to the Defense Information Systems Agency. I couldn't help but notice the discussion about autonomous defense systems, and I was wondering if I might join the conversation. Maya felt her pulse quicken as she realized that Mitchell's presence represented a significantly elevated level of scrutiny from someone whose professional responsibilities included identifying and investigating potential security threats. Military intelligence officers were trained to spot inconsistencies and anomalies in people's backgrounds and behavior, and his interest in their conversation suggested he might have been observing her interactions for some time. "Of course," Kevin replied, though his expression suggested he was also recognizing that the dynamic of their conversation had just shifted in ways that might not be entirely comfortable. "We were just discussing the potential vulnerabilities of fully autonomous cybersecurity systems." Mitchell's gaze moved between Kevin and Maya with the methodical attention of someone trained to read people and situations for signs of deception or hidden agendas. When his eyes settled on Maya, she felt the weight of professional assessment that went far beyond casual curiosity about her technical knowledge or background. "And you are?" Mitchell asked, directing the question to Maya with the kind of neutral professionalism that managed to be both polite and subtly intimidating. "Maya Chen," she replied, maintaining her carefully constructed persona while recognizing that Mitchell's military background would make him considerably more difficult to deceive than the civilian security personnel she'd encountered so far. "I'm still trying to understand most of what I'm seeing here. This is all quite beyond my usual experience." Mitchell's expression shifted slightly, his eyebrows drawing together in a way that suggested he was processing her response and finding something about it that didn't align with his expectations. Maya could practically see him evaluating her words against his training in spotting deception and misdirection, and she found herself hoping that her cover story was robust enough to withstand that level of professional scrutiny. "What's your background, if you don't mind me asking?" Mitchell said, his tone maintaining the same neutral professionalism, but with an undertone that suggested his interest was more than casual. It's unusual to see someone without obvious technical expertise at these restricted demonstrations. The question hung in the air with the weight of official inquiry, the kind of probe that could quickly escalate into a more formal investigation if Maya's response raised additional suspicions. She could feel Kevin Park watching her with renewed interest, clearly recognizing that Mitchell's questions were moving beyond polite conversation into territory that might reveal information about her true background and intentions. "I work in administrative support for various government projects," Maya replied, choosing her words carefully to provide an explanation that was technically accurate while avoiding any details that might invite deeper investigation. "I'm not really qualified to evaluate these technologies from a technical perspective, but someone thought I should be familiar with what's being developed." Mitchell's expression remained neutral, but Maya could see the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested her response had generated more questions rather than satisfying his curiosity. She recognized the look because she'd seen it countless times in the faces of interrogators who sensed that the person they were questioning wasn't being entirely forthcoming about their background or motivations. "Administrative support," Mitchell repeated, his tone suggesting he was testing the explanation against his understanding of how government security clearances were typically distributed. "That's interesting. Usually, administrative personnel don't receive access to classified technical demonstrations unless they're involved in program management or oversight functions." Maya felt the conversation moving into increasingly dangerous territory, with Mitchell's questions becoming more pointed and Kevin Park listening with obvious fascination to an exchange that was revealing far more about security protocols than she was comfortable discussing. She needed to find a way to extricate herself from this situation before Mitchell's professional suspicions led him to start making formal inquiries about her background and credentials. "You're probably right," Maya said, injecting a note of uncertainty into her voice that suggested someone who was beginning to worry that she might have been given access to materials beyond her actual authorization level. "I'm starting to think there might have been some kind of administrative error. Maybe I should check with conference staff to make sure I'm supposed to be here." Mitchell's expression shifted again, this time showing something that looked almost like satisfaction, as if her response had confirmed suspicions he'd been developing about her legitimacy. Maya realized that her attempt to deflect his questions by expressing uncertainty about her own authorization had actually made her appear more suspicious rather than less, exactly the opposite of what she'd intended. "That might be a good idea," Mitchell said, his tone carrying the authority of someone who was accustomed to having his suggestions treated as orders. "Security protocols exist for good reasons. and it's important that everyone in these restricted areas has appropriate clearances and legitimate need-to-know access. Before Maya could respond, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another military officer, this one, a woman whose colonel's insignia and confident bearing immediately marked her as someone with significant authority within the defense establishment. She approached their group with the purposeful stride of someone who had been observing their interaction and had decided it was time to intervene. "Colonel Sarah Bennett, Defense Intelligence Agency," she announced, producing credentials that she displayed just long enough for everyone to verify her identity and authority before returning them to her jacket pocket. "Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, I need to speak with you about the latest threat assessment briefings." Mitchell's attention immediately shifted to his superior officer, his posture straightening in automatic recognition of rank and authority. Maya felt a moment of relief that the interruption might allow her to slip away from a conversation that had been becoming increasingly problematic, but Bennett's next words made it clear that she wasn't going to be allowed to simply disappear. "Miss Chen, isn't it?" Bennett said, her tone carrying the kind of casual authority that suggested she'd been monitoring Maya's interactions and had decided to take a more direct approach to whatever concerns had been raised about her presence. "I understand there might be some questions about your access authorization for these demonstrations." Maya felt the weight of official attention settling around her like a net, with military intelligence officers now taking a direct interest in her background and credentials. This was exactly the kind of escalation she'd hoped to avoid, the point where casual curiosity about an unknown attendee transformed into formal security investigation that could expose her true identity and compromise her mission. "I think there might be some confusion," Maya replied, maintaining her cover while recognizing that her options for avoiding deeper scrutiny were rapidly diminishing. "I was invited to attend these sessions, but I'm starting to think there might have been some kind of administrative error about what level of access I was supposed to receive." Bennett studied her with the intense focus of someone trained to extract information from reluctant subjects, her eyes moving over Maya's appearance and demeanor with the methodical attention of a professional interrogator. Maya could feel herself being evaluated not just as a potential security risk, but as a puzzle that needed to be solved through careful application of pressure and observation. "Administrative errors are certainly possible," Bennett said, her tone suggesting she found that explanation less than convincing. "But the security protocols for these demonstrations are quite rigorous. Multiple levels of verification are required before anyone receives access to classified materials. If there was an error, it would represent a significant failure of our security systems." Maya realized that Bennett was essentially calling her bluff, challenging her to either provide more convincing evidence of her legitimacy or admit that her presence here was unauthorized. The military intelligence officer was clearly not someone who would be satisfied with vague explanations or administrative confusion, and her direct approach suggested she was prepared to escalate the matter to whatever level was necessary to resolve the security concerns. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation in a more private setting," Bennett suggested, though her tone made it clear that this was not actually a suggestion but a politely phrased order. "I'm sure we can resolve any confusion about your authorization quickly and efficiently." Maya felt the walls closing in around her carefully constructed cover story, with military intelligence officers now taking direct control of a situation that had started as casual security verification and escalated into what was clearly going to become a formal investigation. She needed to find a way to regain control of the narrative before Bennett's investigation exposed inconsistencies in her background that could lead to her true identity being discovered. The demonstration lab suddenly felt much smaller than it had when she'd first entered, with too many eyes watching her interaction with Bennett and too many ears listening to a conversation that was revealing far more about security protocols and clearance procedures than she was comfortable having become public knowledge. Maya could sense that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether her mission succeeded or whether her carefully planned infiltration collapsed under the weight of official scrutiny. As Bennett gestured toward a door marked "Private Conference Room," Maya realized that she was about to face the kind of interrogation that could expose everything she'd worked to conceal. The next phase of her mission would require all of her training and experience to navigate successfully, and the stakes were about to become considerably higher than they'd been when she'd first walked through the doors of TechSecure corporate headquarters. The conference room door closed behind them with the soft click of electronic locks engaging, and Maya found herself in a windowless space that had obviously been designed for sensitive conversations that required complete privacy. The walls were covered with sound-dampening material, the lighting was designed to eliminate shadows that might conceal facial expressions, and the furniture was arranged to facilitate interrogation rather than casual discussion. Bennett gestured for Maya to take a seat at the small conference table while Mitchell positioned himself near the door, in a stance that suggested he was prepared to prevent any attempt at premature departure. Maya recognized the setup because she'd participated in similar interrogations countless times, though usually from the other side of the table. "Now then," Bennett said, settling into the chair across from Maya with the relaxed confidence of someone who was completely in control of the situation. "Why don't we start with some basic questions about your background and how you came to be here today?" Maya settled into the chair across from Colonel Bennett, her posture deliberately reflecting the nervous uncertainty of someone who found herself in an intimidating situation she didn't fully understand. The interrogation room's sterile environment reminded her of dozens of similar spaces she'd occupied during her government service, though the perspective had been dramatically different then. She kept her hands folded in her lap, fighting the muscle memory that wanted to assess exits and potential weapons, instead maintaining the demeanor of an ordinary civilian who was overwhelmed by official attention. "Let's start with something simple," Bennett said, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who conducted these conversations regularly. "What's your full name, date of birth, and current address?" Maya provided the requested information without hesitation, reciting details that corresponded to her legitimate civilian identity while carefully omitting any reference to the professional background that had brought her to this conference. She watched Bennett make notes on a tablet, recognizing the methodical approach of someone who was building a comprehensive profile that would later be cross-referenced against multiple databases. "And your current employment?" Bennett continued, her eyes never leaving Maya's face as she waited for a response that might reveal inconsistencies or signs of deception. "I do consulting work for various government contractors," Maya replied, choosing her words carefully to provide an explanation that was technically accurate while avoiding specifics that might invite deeper investigation. "Administrative support, mostly. Document management, correspondence coordination, that sort of thing." Mitchell shifted his position near the door, and Maya could sense his skepticism, even without looking in his direction. Her explanation was generic enough to be plausible but vague enough to raise questions about why someone with such mundane responsibilities would receive access to classified technical demonstrations. "Which contractors specifically?" Bennett pressed, her tone remaining professional but with an undertone that suggested she expected more detailed answers than Maya had provided so far. Maya felt the familiar tension that came with navigating interrogations, where providing too much information could be as dangerous as providing too little. She needed to give Bennett enough detail to satisfy immediate curiosity while avoiding specifics that could be verified against government personnel records that might expose her true background. "The contracts change frequently," Maya said, injecting a note of apologetic uncertainty into her voice. "I work through a staffing agency that places people in temporary positions. Sometimes it's document scanning for Defense Department archives, sometimes it's data entry for State Department communications. I don't always know which specific agencies or contractors I'm supporting." Bennett made additional notes, her expression suggesting she was filing away Maya's responses for later verification. Maya recognized the technique because she'd used it herself countless times during intelligence operations, allowing subjects to provide their version of events before comparing their statements against independently verifiable facts. "And how did you learn about this conference?" Bennett asked, shifting her approach to focus on Maya's presence at TechSecure rather than her general background. Maya reached into her bag and produced the printed email she'd prepared as part of her cover story, a carefully crafted communication that appeared to be from a legitimate government contractor, inviting her to attend specific sessions. The document was sophisticated enough to pass casual inspection, while being generic enough to avoid revealing details that could compromise her mission. "I received this about 3 weeks ago," Maya said, handing the printout to Bennett with the careful attention of someone who was trying to be helpful despite her own confusion about the situation. "Honestly, I wasn't entirely sure why I was being invited. The technical aspects are mostly over my head." Bennett examined the document carefully, her eyes scanning the header information and digital signatures that Maya had painstakingly crafted to appear authentic. The email referenced legitimate government programs and included official-looking contact information, but it was deliberately vague about the specific reasons for Maya's invitation to attend the classified demonstrations. "This is from Quantum Solutions Defense Consulting," Bennett observed, reading from the document. "Are you familiar with their work?" Maya shook her head with the convincing bewilderment of someone who was genuinely unclear about the technical details of government contracting. Not really. Like I said, I usually just handle administrative tasks. I don't get involved in the technical or strategic aspects of the projects. Mitchell stepped forward slightly, his expression suggesting he wanted to interject something into the conversation. Bennett glanced in his direction and nodded, apparently giving him permission to pursue his own line of questioning. "Ms. Chen," Mitchell said, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting direct answers to direct questions. "You mentioned that you work through a staffing agency. Which agency specifically, and how long have you been doing this type of work?" Maya felt the interrogation shifting into more dangerous territory, with Mitchell's questions designed to elicit specific details that could be quickly verified against employment databases and government contractor records. She needed to provide answers that would satisfy their immediate curiosity, while avoiding information that might expose the carefully constructed nature of her civilian identity. "Meridian Professional Services," Maya replied, naming a legitimate staffing agency that she'd researched extensively as part of her preparation for this mission. "I've been working with them for about 2 years, mostly on short-term assignments that require security clearances but not specialized technical knowledge." Mitchell made a note of the agency name, and Maya could see him mentally calculating how quickly he could verify her employment history through official channels. She'd chosen Meridian specifically because their client base included numerous government contractors, and their employment records were complex enough to make immediate verification difficult, but she knew that determined investigation would eventually reveal inconsistencies in her background. 2 years, Bennett repeated, her tone suggesting she was processing this information against other details Maya had provided. "That would mean you started this work around the time you would have needed to undergo background investigation for security clearance. What level of clearance do you currently hold?" The question struck at the heart of Maya's carefully constructed deception, because her actual clearance level would immediately identify her as someone with access to far more sensitive information than her cover story suggested. She needed to provide an answer that would explain her presence at the conference while avoiding any details that might trigger deeper investigation into her true background. "Secret level," Maya said, choosing a clearance classification that was common enough to be unremarkable but sufficient to justify her access to some classified materials. "Though I have to admit, I don't really understand all the different levels and what they mean for different types of information." Bennett's expression shifted slightly, her eyebrows drawing together in a way that suggested Maya's response had generated additional questions rather than satisfying her concerns. Maya recognized the look because she'd seen it countless times in the faces of interrogators who sensed that the person they were questioning wasn't being entirely forthcoming about their background or capabilities. "Secret clearance would typically be sufficient for the main conference sessions," Bennett said, her tone carrying a note of skepticism that suggested she was building toward a more pointed question. "But the demonstrations you've been attending require top-secret clearance with specific compartmented access. Your badge indicates you have authorization for those restricted sessions." Maya felt her pulse quicken as she realized that Bennett had identified a significant inconsistency in her cover story, the kind of discrepancy that could quickly escalate into formal investigation if not addressed convincingly. She needed to find a way to explain the mismatch between her claimed clearance level and her actual conference access without revealing the true source of her credentials. "I honestly don't understand how the clearance levels work," Maya said, maintaining her pose of administrative confusion while recognizing that this explanation was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain under professional scrutiny. "Someone told me I was cleared to attend these sessions, but maybe there was some kind of upgrade or special authorization that I wasn't aware of." Mitchell exchanged a glance with Bennett, the kind of nonverbal communication between experienced interrogators that suggested they both recognized they were dealing with someone whose story wasn't holding up under examination. Maya could feel the dynamic in the room shifting as the two officers began to coordinate their approach to extracting more reliable information about her background and intentions. Before either of them could pursue the clearance discrepancy further, their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the conference room door. Bennett looked annoyed at the interruption, but she gestured for Mitchell to see who was requesting access to their private discussion. Mitchell opened the door to reveal a young man in his late 20s, whose appearance immediately marked him as technical staff rather than security personnel. He was dressed in the casual attire of someone who spent most of his time working with computer systems, and his manner suggested someone who was nervous about interrupting important people, but had information he believed was significant. "Colonel Bennett," the technician said, his voice carrying the tentative quality of someone who wasn't entirely sure he should be speaking up. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think there might be something you should know about the security scan results from earlier today." Bennett's expression sharpened with interest, her attention shifting from Maya to the technician with the focus of someone who recognized that new information might be relevant to her current investigation. "What kind of scan results?" "The enhanced screening system flagged something unusual in one of the conference attendees this morning," the technician replied, glancing briefly at Maya before returning his attention to Bennett. "The scanner detected what appeared to be some kind of electronic device embedded in the subject's arm, but the attending security officer logged it as medical hardware." Maya felt her blood turn to ice as she realized that the technician was describing the detection of her implanted microchip, the piece of classified technology that she'd hoped would remain unnoticed throughout her time at the conference. The enhanced screening system had been more sophisticated than she'd anticipated, capable of detecting the chip even though the security guards had accepted her explanation of surgical hardware. "Electronic device?" Bennett asked, her tone carrying new intensity as she processed the potential security implications of what the technician was describing. "What kind of electronic device?" "That's what's unusual," the technician continued, his confidence growing as he realized he had Bennett's full attention. "The scanner reading suggests it's some kind of sophisticated chip with active transmission capabilities, but it's much smaller and more advanced than anything in our equipment database. The signal characteristics don't match any known medical devices or consumer electronics." Bennett's gaze shifted back to Maya with renewed suspicion, her eyes narrowing as she processed the possibility that the woman she'd been interrogating might be carrying concealed surveillance equipment or other unauthorized technology. Maya could see the mental calculations taking place as Bennett considered the implications of an unidentified electronic device in the possession of someone whose background was already raising questions. "Which attendee?" Bennett asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. The technician consulted the tablet he was carrying, scrolling through what appeared to be a list of security incidents from the morning's screening process. "Maya Chen," he said, confirming Bennett's suspicions. "The device was detected in her left forearm during the enhanced screening at approximately 10:30 this morning." Maya fought to maintain her composure as she felt the walls of her carefully constructed deception closing in around her. The discovery of the microchip represented exactly the kind of physical evidence that could expose her true identity if subjected to detailed analysis, and she recognized that her mission was rapidly approaching a crisis point that would require immediate decision-making about how much of her background she was willing to reveal. "Ms. Chen," Bennett said, her voice carrying the cold authority of someone who had just identified a significant security threat, "would you care to explain why you're carrying an unidentified electronic device that's sophisticated enough to transmit data?" Maya realized that her options had narrowed to either maintaining her cover story in the face of overwhelming physical evidence, or revealing enough of her true background to explain the presence of the chip without completely compromising her mission. She could see Mitchell moving closer to the table, his posture suggesting someone who was prepared to physically restrain her if she made any sudden movements. "I told the security guard this morning that I had surgical hardware from an old injury," Maya said, maintaining her story while recognizing that this explanation was becoming increasingly untenable given the technician's description of the device's capabilities. "Surgical hardware doesn't transmit data," Bennett replied, her tone leaving no room for continued deception. "What you're carrying is sophisticated electronics that our systems can't identify. That represents a significant security threat, and I need you to explain exactly what it is and why you have it." Maya could feel the interrogation reaching a tipping point where continued evasion would only make her situation worse. She needed to find a way to provide enough information to diffuse the immediate security concerns, while avoiding revelations that could compromise the larger intelligence operation that had brought her to this conference. "I think there might be some confusion about what the scanner detected," Maya said, buying time while she calculated her options. "I'm not carrying any kind of surveillance equipment or unauthorized electronics." Bennett's expression suggested she found Maya's continued denials unconvincing, given the technical evidence that had been presented. She gestured to the technician, who stepped forward with his tablet and began setting up what appeared to be a portable scanning device that would allow them to examine the chip in Maya's arm more closely. "We're going to resolve this confusion right now," Bennett said, her tone carrying the finality of someone who was no longer interested in verbal explanations. This scanner will tell us exactly what kind of device you're carrying and what its capabilities are. Maya watched the technician prepare the scanning equipment, recognizing that she was moments away from having her most sensitive secret exposed to people who had both the authority and the technical capability to investigate her background thoroughly. The microchip contained enough encrypted data to identify her as someone whose actual credentials were far beyond what her cover story suggested, and its discovery would inevitably lead to questions that could expose her entire mission. As the technician powered up the scanner, Maya made a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her infiltration operation. She could continue to maintain her cover and hope that the chip's encryption would prevent Bennett from accessing its contents. Or she could begin revealing controlled portions of her true background in an attempt to maintain some level of operational security while satisfying the legitimate concerns of the military intelligence officers who were investigating her presence. "Before you use that scanner," Maya said quietly, her voice carrying a new quality that suggested someone who was about to abandon pretense in favor of more direct communication. "There are some things about my background that I should probably explain." Bennett paused in her instructions to the technician, her attention focusing entirely on Maya, with the intensity of someone who recognized that they were about to hear information that would significantly change their understanding of the situation. Mitchell stepped closer to the table, his posture suggesting someone who was prepared for this conversation to take an unexpected turn. "I'm listening," Bennett said, her tone neutral but expectant. Maya took a deep breath, knowing that whatever she said next would commit her to a level of revelation that could either salvage her mission or destroy it entirely. She'd spent her career operating in the shadows, maintaining cover identities that allowed her to access sensitive information without exposing her true capabilities or affiliations. Now she was facing a situation where partial honesty might be the only path forward. "The device in my arm isn't medical hardware," Maya said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "It's a classified identification chip issued by the National Security Agency for personnel involved in deep cover operations." The silence that followed her statement was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the conference room's ventilation system. Bennett's expression shifted from skepticism to something approaching shock as she processed the implications of what Maya had just revealed. Mitchell's posture changed as well, his stance reflecting the alertness of someone who had just learned that the situation was far more complex than he'd initially understood. "NSA," Bennett repeated, her voice carrying a mixture of surprise and calculation, as she considered how this revelation changed her assessment of Maya's presence at the conference. "Are you telling me you're an active intelligence operative?" Maya recognized that she'd crossed a line that would require careful navigation to avoid compromising operational security while providing enough information to resolve the immediate crisis. She needed to reveal enough of her background to explain the chip's presence without exposing details that could interfere with ongoing intelligence operations or put other operatives at risk. "Former," Maya replied carefully, maintaining eye contact with Bennett while choosing her words with precision. "I left active service 3 years ago, but certain identification protocols remain in place for security reasons." Bennett exchanged another glance with Mitchell, the kind of professional communication between intelligence officers who were rapidly reassessing their understanding of a situation that had suddenly become much more complicated. Maya could see them processing the implications of her revelation, calculating how the presence of a former NSA operative at a classified technology conference might relate to ongoing security concerns or intelligence operations. "What was your operational specialty?" Mitchell asked, his tone carrying new respect but also increased wariness, as he recognized that he was dealing with someone whose training and capabilities might be significantly more extensive than her appearance suggested. Maya hesitated, knowing that revealing details about her specific area of expertise would provide information that could be used to identify her role in classified operations that were still ongoing or recently concluded. She needed to provide enough information to establish her credibility without compromising operational security or exposing intelligence methods and capabilities. "Cyber operations," she said finally, offering a general description that was accurate without being specific enough to compromise sensitive information. "Network penetration, data extraction, defensive countermeasures." Bennett leaned back in her chair, her expression reflecting the mental adjustments required to incorporate this new information into her assessment of Maya's background and intentions. Maya could see her recalculating everything from Maya's presence at the conference to her responses during the interrogation, viewing them through the lens of someone who possessed extensive training in deception and intelligence operations. Former NSA cyber operative with embedded identification technology, Bennett said, apparently summarizing the situation for her own understanding as much as for Mitchell's benefit. That would certainly explain your security clearance and your access to classified demonstrations. Maya nodded, recognizing that she'd successfully navigated the immediate crisis of the chip's discovery while revealing enough of her background to satisfy Bennett's security concerns. However, she also understood that this revelation would inevitably lead to additional questions about her current activities and her reasons for attending the conference under a cover identity. The technician who had brought the scanner looked confused by the turn the conversation had taken, clearly uncertain whether he should proceed with examining the chip or wait for further instructions from Bennett. Maya could see him glancing between the military intelligence officers, obviously aware that he'd stumbled into a situation that was beyond his security clearance level. "That will be all for now," Bennett told the technician, dismissing him with the authority of someone who needed to continue the conversation without additional witnesses. "Please ensure that your scanner readings remain classified until further notice." After the technician left, Bennett turned her attention back to Maya with renewed intensity. The discovery of Maya's intelligence background had answered some questions while raising others, and Maya could sense that the interrogation was entering a new phase that would require even more careful navigation. "Now then," Bennett said, her tone carrying new weight as she addressed someone she now recognized as a professional peer rather than a potential security threat. "Why don't you tell me why a former NSA cyber operative is attending this conference under administrative cover?" Maya met Bennett's gaze steadily, recognizing that she'd reached the point where strategic honesty was her only viable option. The conference room felt smaller now, the weight of her partial revelation hanging in the air between them like an unexploded ordnance that could either defuse the situation or make it exponentially worse. "The technologies being demonstrated here represent potential vulnerabilities that extend beyond normal cybersecurity concerns," Maya said, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood that every syllable could have far-reaching consequences. "There are indications that some of these systems may have been compromised before they reached the demonstration phase." Bennett's expression sharpened with professional interest, her posture shifting as she recognized that Maya's presence at the conference might be related to ongoing intelligence operations rather than simple professional curiosity. Mitchell moved closer to the table, his attention fully focused on Maya as he processed the implications of what she was suggesting. "Compromised how?" Bennett asked, her tone carrying the authority of someone who was accustomed to receiving briefings on threats to national security. Maya hesitated, aware that she was approaching the boundaries of what she could reveal without potentially interfering with active investigations or exposing intelligence sources and methods. Her presence at the conference was based on information gathered through channels that existed outside normal government oversight, and revealing too much could compromise operations that were still in progress. "I can't provide specific details without compromising ongoing assessments," Maya replied, maintaining the careful balance between cooperation and operational security that defined professional intelligence work. "But there are concerns about the integrity of some supply chains and development processes." Before Bennett could respond, their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the conference room door opening without the courtesy of a preliminary knock. Maya turned to see a man in his early 60s entering the room, with the confident stride of someone who was accustomed to having doors open for him rather than opening them himself. His appearance immediately marked him as someone with significant authority within the government hierarchy, from his perfectly tailored suit to the subtle confidence that suggested he'd never encountered a door he couldn't walk through. "Colonel Bennett," the newcomer said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was accustomed to having his words treated as commands rather than suggestions. "I understand you're conducting a security investigation." Bennett rose from her chair with the automatic deference of someone recognizing superior rank and authority, her posture shifting into the formal alertness that marked military personnel responding to the presence of someone significantly higher in the chain of command. Mitchell snapped to attention beside the door, his bearing reflecting the same recognition of hierarchical authority. "Director Hawthorne," Bennett replied, her tone carrying surprise mixed with professional respect. "I wasn't aware you were attending the conference." Director Hawthorne's gaze swept over the conference room, taking in the interrogation setup and the obvious tension that marked a security investigation in progress. When his eyes settled on Maya, his expression shifted subtly, eyebrows drawing together in a way that suggested recognition, trying to surface through layers of memory and professional context. "I'm not here for the conference," Hawthorne said, his attention still focused on Maya with the intensity of someone trying to place a face in the appropriate professional context. "I'm here because certain intelligence indicators suggested there might be security concerns that required direct oversight." Maya felt her pulse quicken as she realized that Hawthorne's presence represented a level of official attention that could either validate her mission or expose it as unauthorized intelligence gathering that violated protocols she was no longer officially bound to follow. She studied his face, trying to determine whether his apparent recognition of her was based on positive or negative associations. "Maya Chen," Hawthorne said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had just identified a significant piece of a complex puzzle. "I thought that name sounded familiar when it appeared on the restricted access list." The silence that followed his statement stretched across the conference room like a physical presence. With Bennett and Mitchell clearly recognizing that they were witnessing the emergence of information that would fundamentally change their understanding of the situation, Maya felt the familiar tension that accompanied moments when carefully constructed cover identities began to unravel under the scrutiny of people who possessed the authority and knowledge to see through operational deceptions. "Director," Maya replied, her voice carrying new formality as she acknowledged his recognition, while trying to gauge whether his knowledge of her background would help or hinder her current mission. Hawthorne moved closer to the table, his posture shifting from the casual authority of someone making an unexpected visit to the focused attention of someone who had just identified a situation that required his personal intervention. Maya could see him processing her presence at the conference against whatever information he possessed about her background and capabilities. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hawthorne said, addressing Bennett and Mitchell with the tone of someone who was about to provide information that would significantly alter their perspective on the investigation they'd been conducting. "I think there are some things about Ms. Chen's background that you should understand before we continue." Bennett's expression reflected the confusion of someone who had been conducting what she believed was a routine security investigation, only to discover that it involved personnel and operations beyond her normal area of responsibility. Maya could see her trying to process the implications of a director-level official taking personal interest in someone she'd identified as a potential security threat. "Sir," Bennett said carefully, "we've established that Ms. Chen is former NSA with current security clearances, but there are questions about her reasons for attending these demonstrations under administrative cover." Hawthorne's expression shifted to something that looked almost like amusement, the kind of reaction that suggested Bennett's summary of Maya's background was dramatically incomplete in ways that would soon become apparent. He glanced at Maya, his eyes carrying a mixture of professional respect and something that might have been concern about the operational implications of her presence. "Former NSA," Hawthorne repeated, his tone suggesting that this description fell significantly short of capturing the full scope of Maya's professional history. "Colonel Bennett, the woman you've been interrogating isn't just former NSA. She's Maya Chen." The way he spoke her name carried weight that suggested it should mean something to Bennett and Mitchell, though their expressions indicated they weren't familiar with whatever significance Hawthorne was attributing to her identity. Maya felt exposed in a way that went beyond the revelation of her intelligence background, recognizing that Hawthorne was about to provide information about her career that she'd hoped would remain buried in classified files. "I'm sorry, sir," Bennett said, her tone reflecting genuine confusion about why Maya's name should carry special significance. "Should we be familiar with that name?" Hawthorne looked surprised that Bennett didn't recognize Maya's identity, his expression shifting as he realized that her operational history might be less well known within the broader intelligence community than he'd assumed. Maya felt a moment of relief that her work had apparently remained sufficiently classified to avoid becoming common knowledge among military intelligence officers. "Operation Digital Fortress," Hawthorne said, providing context that immediately changed the dynamic in the room. "The infiltration of the Iranian nuclear control systems, the disruption of the North Korean missile guidance networks, the preemptive neutralization of the Russian cyber warfare capabilities during the Baltic crisis." Maya watched Bennett's expression transform as Hawthorne provided details about operations that had obviously been significant enough to become part of classified briefings for senior military intelligence personnel. She could see recognition dawning in Bennett's eyes, the moment when abstract operational reports became connected to the person sitting across from her. Ghost protocol, Bennett said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had just connected Maya's identity to operational histories that existed in the realm of classified legend. Your ghost protocol. Maya felt the familiar mixture of pride and discomfort that always accompanied recognition of her operational successes, particularly when that recognition came from people who understood the technical complexity and strategic significance of what those operations had achieved. Ghost Protocol had been her operational codename during the most sensitive and successful cyber operations of her career, missions that had prevented international crises while remaining completely invisible to public awareness. Among other designations, Hawthorne confirmed, his tone carrying the respect of someone who understood the strategic impact of Maya's work during her active service. Ms. Chen was responsible for some of the most successful cyber operations in modern intelligence history, missions that prevented 3 potential international conflicts and neutralized dozens of significant threats to national security. Mitchell's posture had shifted from the formal attention of someone responding to superior authority to something approaching awe, as he processed the realization that he'd been treating someone whose operational achievements were the subject of classified case studies in military intelligence training. Maya could see him mentally recalculating everything from her appearance to her responses during the interrogation, viewing them through the lens of someone whose training and capabilities were at the highest levels of professional excellence. Jesus Christ, Mitchell said quietly, his voice carrying the shock of someone who had just realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. We had you in here like you were some kind of security threat. Maya felt the power dynamic in the room shift dramatically as Bennett and Mitchell processed the revelation of her true professional status. The suspicion and interrogation techniques that had defined their earlier interaction were being replaced by the deference and respect typically accorded to someone whose operational achievements had earned recognition at the highest levels of government. Ms. Chen's presence here is undoubtedly related to legitimate security concerns, Hawthorne continued, his tone suggesting that he understood Maya's mission even if he wasn't entirely supportive of her methods. Though I suspect she's operating outside official channels in ways that may complicate our response options. Maya recognized that Hawthorne's statement was both a validation of her mission and a subtle warning about the potential consequences of conducting intelligence operations without proper authorization. She needed to find a way to leverage the credibility that came with his recognition, while avoiding revelations that could interfere with ongoing investigations or expose her to official sanction for unauthorized activities. The technologies being demonstrated here represent potential vulnerabilities that require assessment, Maya said, providing enough information to justify her presence while avoiding details that could compromise her intelligence sources. There are indications of systematic compromises that extend beyond individual systems or vendors. Hawthorne nodded, his expression suggesting that Maya's assessment aligned with intelligence concerns that had brought him to the conference as well. Bennett and Mitchell exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that they were witnessing the convergence of multiple intelligence operations that were beyond their normal area of responsibility. Systematic compromises, Hawthorne repeated, his tone carrying the weight of someone who understood the strategic implications of what Maya was suggesting. That would explain some of the anomalies we've been tracking in classified technology development programs. Maya felt a moment of relief that her mission was being validated by someone whose authority extended far beyond the conference security apparatus, but she also recognized that Hawthorne's presence indicated that her concerns were part of larger intelligence investigations that might require coordination and oversight she wasn't prepared to provide. Before anyone could respond, their conversation was interrupted by another knock on the conference room door, this one more urgent and insistent than the earlier interruption. Bennett glanced at Hawthorne for permission before instructing whoever was outside to enter, her deference reflecting the shift in authority that had occurred since his arrival. Dr. Patricia Hayes entered the room with the swift stride of someone who had been searching for specific people and had finally located them. Her expression carried a mixture of relief and concern that suggested she'd been attempting to track down either Maya or Hawthorne for reasons that were both urgent and significant. Director Hawthorne, Hayes said, her voice carrying the controlled urgency of someone delivering information that couldn't wait for more convenient timing. I've been trying to reach you. We have a situation in the quantum encryption demonstration that requires immediate attention. Hawthorne's expression sharpened with professional concern, his attention shifting from the interrogation of Maya to whatever crisis had prompted Hayes to seek him out personally. Maya felt the room's focus shifting away from her background and toward operational concerns that might be directly related to the intelligence gathering that had brought her to the conference. "What kind of situation?" Hawthorne asked, his tone carrying the authority of someone who was accustomed to receiving briefings on emerging threats and making immediate decisions about response options. Hayes glanced around the room, clearly noting the presence of Bennett and Mitchell before deciding that the urgency of her information outweighed concerns about security clearances and need-to-know restrictions. Maya recognized the expression because she'd worn it herself countless times when operational requirements conflicted with normal security protocols. "The quantum encryption system demonstrated this morning has been transmitting unauthorized data packets to external servers," Hayes said, her words carrying the impact of someone revealing a significant security breach. "Our monitoring systems detected the transmissions about an hour ago, but preliminary analysis suggests the unauthorized communications may have been ongoing for several days." Maya felt her pulse quicken as she realized that Hayes was describing exactly the kind of systemic compromise she'd come to investigate, the type of sophisticated infiltration that could compromise multiple classified programs while remaining invisible to normal security monitoring. This was the validation of her intelligence concerns that she'd hoped to find, but it was also confirmation that the threats were more immediate and extensive than she'd anticipated. "Several days," Hawthorne repeated, his tone carrying the weight of someone calculating the potential scope of compromised information. That would include the preliminary briefings and setup procedures for multiple classified demonstrations. Bennett and Mitchell were clearly struggling to follow a conversation that involved operational details beyond their normal area of responsibility. But Maya could see them recognizing that they were witnessing the emergence of a significant security crisis that would require response at levels far above their authority. "Dr. Hayes," Maya said, her voice carrying new authority as she addressed someone she now recognized as a key figure in the investigation she'd come to conduct. "Have you been able to determine the specific nature of the data being transmitted?" Hayes turned her attention to Maya with surprise, clearly not expecting to receive technically sophisticated questions from someone she'd previously dismissed as an administrative attendee. Maya could see her processing the shift in room dynamics and trying to understand why Maya was suddenly being treated as someone whose technical opinions were relevant to classified security discussions. "The packets appeared to contain encrypted copies of demonstration protocols, system specifications, and attendee information," Hayes replied, her tone suggesting she was still uncertain about Maya's role in the emerging crisis, but willing to provide information to anyone who might help address the situation. Hawthorne gestured for Hayes to take a seat at the conference table, his manner indicating that the quantum encryption breach represented a security crisis that would require immediate coordination between multiple agencies and personnel. Maya recognized that her mission was evolving from intelligence gathering into active crisis response, though her unofficial status might complicate her ability to participate in whatever response operations were about to be initiated. "Miss Chen," Hawthorne said, addressing her with the formal respect due to someone whose expertise was suddenly essential to resolving a critical situation. "Based on your assessment of potential systematic compromises, do you believe this quantum encryption breach is an isolated incident or part of a larger infiltration operation?" Maya felt the weight of professional responsibility settling around her as she recognized that her intelligence concerns were being validated in real time by the emergence of active security breaches. The question required her to synthesize information gathered through unofficial channels with the new data about the quantum encryption compromise, providing analysis that could influence national security response decisions. "Based on the patterns I've been tracking, this is almost certainly part of a coordinated infiltration campaign targeting multiple classified technology programs," Maya replied, her voice carrying the confidence of someone whose professional assessment was being sought by people with the authority to act on her recommendations. The conference room fell silent as everyone processed the implications of Maya's assessment, recognizing that they were dealing with a security crisis that extended far beyond the immediate compromise of a single demonstration system. Maya could see Hawthorne calculating response options while Bennett and Mitchell struggled to comprehend the scope of what was being revealed. "Coordinated infiltration campaign," Hawthorne said, his tone carrying the weight of someone who understood that Maya's assessment would require immediate escalation to the highest levels of government security apparatus. That would suggest state-level actors with sophisticated technical capabilities and extensive intelligence about our classified technology programs. Maya nodded, recognizing that her mission had successfully identified the systematic vulnerabilities she'd come to investigate. but also understanding that the scope of the threat was more extensive and immediate than she'd anticipated when she'd first walked through the doors of TechSecure corporate headquarters. The revelation of her true identity had transformed her from a suspected security threat into a key asset in responding to an active national security crisis. But it had also exposed her to levels of official scrutiny and operational oversight that could complicate her ability to continue working through the unofficial channels that had brought her to this discovery. As Hawthorne began making calls to coordinate response operations and Hayes prepared to provide detailed briefings on the quantum encryption breach, Maya realized that her carefully planned infiltration had evolved into something far more complex and consequential than she'd ever intended. The game had changed completely, and Maya Chen was now operating at the center of a crisis that would test every skill she'd developed during her years of service, while potentially exposing her to risks that extended far beyond the professional consequences she'd initially calculated. She was no longer an unknown observer gathering intelligence from the margins of a classified conference. She was Ghost Protocol, and the ghosts she'd spent years hunting had finally revealed themselves in ways that would require every capability she possessed to neutralize. The Crisis Command Center that had been hastily established in TechSecure's executive conference room buzzed with the controlled urgency of professionals responding to a national security emergency. Maya found herself at the center of coordinated response operations that involved personnel from multiple agencies. Her transition from suspected security threat to essential technical expert having occurred with the kind of dramatic reversal that only happened when real expertise met genuine crisis. Director Hawthorne had commandeered the room's wall-mounted displays, transforming them into a comprehensive visualization of the security breach that showed real-time data flows, compromised systems, and the scope of unauthorized information extraction. Dr. Hayes worked at a bank of laptops, her fingers flying across keyboards as she coordinated with technical teams throughout the building to isolate affected systems and trace the source of the breach. Maya stood at the primary analysis station, her earlier pose of technological uncertainty completely abandoned as she interfaced with sophisticated monitoring equipment that would have challenged most cybersecurity professionals. The transformation in her demeanor was striking, her movements now carrying the confidence and precision of someone whose expertise was being applied to problems that matched her actual capabilities. The infiltration vector is more sophisticated than anything we've encountered in previous state-sponsored attacks, Maya said, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose technical assessment was being sought by people with the power to authorize military responses. The malware appears to have been embedded at the firmware level during the manufacturing process, which means the compromise occurred before the systems ever reached secure facilities. Bennett and Mitchell flanked the entrance to the conference room, their role having shifted from interrogators to security coordinators, responsible for ensuring that sensitive response operations remained protected from additional threats. Both officers watched Maya work with expressions that reflected their ongoing adjustment to understanding that the woman they'd been questioning possessed capabilities that exceeded most of their technical specialists. Hawthorne studied the data flowing across multiple screens, his expression grave as he processed the implications of Maya's analysis. Manufacturing-level compromise suggests coordination between multiple hostile actors and extensive penetration of our technology supply chains, he said, his tone carrying the weight of someone who understood that the breach represented threats to national security that extended far beyond the immediate conference environment. Maya manipulated the analysis interface with practiced efficiency, her commands revealing layers of hidden data structures and unauthorized communication protocols that had been invisible to conventional security monitoring. The sophistication of her investigation demonstrated technical capabilities that went far beyond what most cybersecurity professionals could achieve, even with access to the same tools and information. The attack appears to be targeting specific classified programs across multiple government agencies, Maya continued, highlighting data patterns that showed systematic extraction of information from diverse sources. The quantum encryption demonstration was just one of several compromised systems. We're looking at coordinated infiltration of naval communications protocols, missile guidance systems, and satellite control networks. Dr. Hayes looked up from her coordination efforts, her expression reflecting the shock of someone who had just realized that what she'd identified as a single security incident was actually part of a comprehensive attack on critical national infrastructure. "How is that possible?" she asked, her voice carrying the bewilderment of someone whose understanding of the threat landscape was being fundamentally challenged. Maya turned from the analysis station to address Hayes directly, her manner reflecting the patience of someone explaining complex technical concepts to intelligent people who lacked specialized knowledge. "The attackers have been planning this for years," she said, her tone carrying the certainty of someone whose analysis was based on extensive investigation and professional experience. "They identified critical vulnerabilities in our technology development and procurement processes, then systematically exploited those vulnerabilities to embed surveillance capabilities in systems that we considered secure." The implications of Maya's assessment settled over the room like a heavy blanket, with everyone present recognizing that they were dealing with a threat that represented one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations in modern history. Hawthorne's expression reflected the mental calculations of someone determining what level of response would be required to address a crisis of this magnitude. "How do we stop it?" Hawthorne asked, his question cutting to the heart of what everyone in the room needed to know. Maya returned her attention to the analysis station, her fingers moving across interfaces as she began implementing countermeasures that demonstrated capabilities most government cybersecurity teams would have required days or weeks to develop. "The good news is that the attackers designed their infiltration to remain invisible for extended periods, which means they prioritize stealth over immediate damage potential," she said, her voice steady despite the complexity of the technical operations she was performing. "We can use that against them. Their communication protocols are sophisticated but predictable once you understand the underlying architecture. I can trace the data flows back to their command and control servers, then feed them false information while we identify and neutralize the compromised systems." Bennett stepped forward slightly, her expression reflecting newfound respect for Maya's capabilities mixed with concern about the scope of what was being revealed. "How long will that take?" she asked, her tone carrying the urgency of someone who understood that every minute of delay could result in additional classified information being extracted. Maya paused in her technical work to consider the question, her assessment requiring her to balance the complexity of the required countermeasures against the resources available and the time constraints imposed by ongoing data extraction. "With the right support from agency technical teams, I can have preliminary countermeasures in place within hours," she replied, her confidence reflecting years of experience with similar crisis response operations. "Complete neutralization of the threat will require coordination with multiple agencies and probably several days of intensive work, but we can stop the immediate data bleeding much faster than that." Hawthorne nodded, his expression reflecting the relief of someone who had just learned that a crisis that seemed overwhelming might actually be manageable with the right expertise and resources. "What do you need?" he asked, his tone carrying the authority of someone who was prepared to authorize whatever support Maya required. Maya's response demonstrated the kind of comprehensive understanding of government resources and capabilities that only came from extensive experience with classified operations. She rattled off a list of technical specialists, database access requirements, and coordination protocols that would allow her to leverage the full scope of government cybersecurity resources in responding to the breach. As Hawthorne began making calls to arrange the support Maya had requested, Dr. Hayes approached the analysis station with obvious curiosity about the technical methods Maya was employing. "I have to ask," Hayes said, her voice carrying the interest of someone whose professional focus was advanced cybersecurity technologies. "How did you identify these patterns when our most sophisticated monitoring systems missed them completely?" Maya looked up from her work, her expression carrying the slight smile of someone who appreciated a good technical question. "Your monitoring systems are designed to detect known attack signatures and obvious anomalies," she replied, her tone reflecting the patience of someone explaining fundamental concepts. "These attackers were specifically targeting those detection methods, designing their infiltration to mimic normal system behaviors and legitimate data flows. The key to identifying this type of attack is looking for patterns that are statistically normal but operationally suspicious. The individual data transmissions looked legitimate, but the aggregate pattern of information requests was inconsistent with how these systems should actually be used." Hayes nodded slowly, her expression reflecting the appreciation of someone who was learning advanced techniques from a genuine expert. "That kind of analysis requires understanding both the technical architecture and the operational context," she observed, her tone carrying new respect for the complexity of Maya's expertise. "Most cybersecurity professionals specialize in one or the other, but not both." Maya returned her attention to the countermeasure implementation, her work requiring the kind of sustained concentration that left little room for extended conversation. However, she paused long enough to offer a response that reflected her understanding of the broader professional challenges in cybersecurity. The most dangerous threats exploit the gaps between technical and operational knowledge, she said, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won experience. You can't defend against sophisticated attacks unless you understand both how the systems work and how they're supposed to be used. Most training programs focus on one perspective or the other, but real-world security requires integrating both. As Maya continued her technical work, other personnel began arriving in response to Hawthorne's coordination calls. Senior analysts from multiple agencies, technical specialists with specialized expertise in compromised systems, and coordination staff responsible for managing multi-agency response operations. The conference room was transformed into a comprehensive command center that reflected the full scope of government cybersecurity capabilities. Maya found herself at the center of increasingly complex technical discussions, her analysis serving as the foundation for response operations that would ultimately involve dozens of agencies and hundreds of personnel. Her transition from unknown conference attendee to essential technical leader was complete, though she maintained the same focused professionalism that had characterized her work throughout her government career. Colonel Bennett approached Maya during a brief lull in the technical coordination, her expression reflecting the kind of personal recognition that suggested someone who had learned important lessons from the day's events. "Miss Chen," she said, her tone carrying genuine respect mixed with something that might have been embarrassment about their earlier interaction. "I owe you an apology. When we first encountered you this morning, I made assumptions about your background and capabilities that were completely wrong." Maya looked up from the analysis station, her expression carrying the kind of understanding that suggested someone who had encountered similar situations countless times throughout her career. "You were doing your job," she replied, her tone carrying no hint of resentment or satisfaction at Bennett's admission. "Security protocols exist for good reasons, and questioning unknown attendees at classified events is exactly what you should have been doing." Bennett's expression suggested she appreciated Maya's professional response, but she continued with the persistence of someone who felt the need to acknowledge a significant professional misjudgment. "But I let my assumptions about your appearance and manner influence my assessment of whether you belonged here," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone confronting her own biases. That's exactly the kind of thinking that sophisticated adversaries exploit. They count on people making quick judgments based on surface appearances rather than taking the time to verify actual capabilities and credentials. Maya paused in her technical work to give Bennett her full attention, recognizing that this conversation represented an important learning moment that extended beyond the immediate crisis response. "The hardest lesson in security work is learning that the most dangerous people often look the most harmless," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years operating in environments where appearances were designed to deceive. Hostile operatives spend enormous amounts of time and resources developing cover identities that will pass casual inspection. They study how to dress, how to speak, how to behave in ways that make security personnel comfortable rather than suspicious. Bennett nodded slowly, her expression reflecting the mental adjustments required to incorporate Maya's perspective into her understanding of security threats and assessment procedures. "So the fact that you didn't look like a typical conference attendee should have been a reason for additional scrutiny rather than dismissal," she observed, her tone suggesting someone working through the implications of what she was learning. "Exactly," Maya replied, returning her attention to the technical work while continuing the conversation. "Real security requires looking beyond appearances to verify actual credentials and capabilities. It's more work than making quick judgments based on dress and manner, but it's the only way to identify actual threats while avoiding false positives." Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell joined the conversation, his expression carrying the same mixture of respect and professional curiosity that had characterized Bennett's approach. "The training implications of what you're describing are significant," he said, his tone reflecting someone who was thinking about how to incorporate new understanding into existing security protocols. "Most of our personnel are trained to look for obvious signs of suspicious behavior or inappropriate presence, but sophisticated adversaries specifically design their operations to avoid triggering those warning signs." Maya manipulated the analysis interface to highlight specific data patterns, using the ongoing investigation to illustrate broader points about threat assessment and security analysis. "The same principles apply to technical security," she said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone whose expertise extended across multiple domains. The most dangerous cyber attacks are designed to look like normal system activity, just like the most dangerous human operatives are designed to look like normal conference attendees. Effective security requires understanding both what normal looks like and what sophisticated abnormal is designed to mimic. Dr. Hayes, who had been monitoring the conversation while coordinating her own technical responses, looked up with obvious interest in the intersection between technical and human security challenges. That suggests our security training needs to emphasize pattern recognition and statistical analysis, rather than just checklist verification, she observed, her tone reflecting someone who was considering practical applications of Maya's insights. Maya nodded approvingly, recognizing that Hayes was making connections between abstract security principles and concrete operational improvements. The best security professionals are the ones who can think like attackers, she said, her voice carrying the weight of extensive experience with both offensive and defensive operations. They understand that sophisticated threats are specifically designed to exploit the assumptions and shortcuts that make normal security procedures efficient. Real protection requires being willing to do the extra work of thorough verification, even when initial assessments suggest everything is normal. As the conversation continued, Maya found herself serving not only as the technical lead for crisis response operations, but also as an informal instructor for security personnel who were learning advanced concepts about threat assessment and operational security. Her ability to operate effectively in both roles reflected the comprehensive expertise that had made her successful during her government career. Hawthorne returned from his coordination calls with an expression that suggested the support Maya had requested was being mobilized with appropriate urgency. "We have technical teams from 6 agencies standing by to implement your countermeasures," he announced, his tone carrying the satisfaction of someone who had successfully navigated complex bureaucratic processes to achieve essential operational goals. "Additionally, we have authorization to coordinate with international partners to address the overseas components of this infiltration network." Maya's response reflected her understanding of the complex coordination requirements for multi-agency cybersecurity operations. She outlined implementation priorities, resource allocation strategies, and timeline expectations that demonstrated comprehensive knowledge of how government technical capabilities could be leveraged to address sophisticated threats. The next several hours passed in intensive technical work, with Maya serving as the central coordinator for countermeasure implementation that involved dozens of specialists working across multiple time zones and security environments. Her ability to maintain situational awareness while managing complex technical operations reflected the kind of operational excellence that had defined her most successful government missions. As the immediate crisis response began showing positive results, with compromised systems being isolated and unauthorized data flows being interrupted, Maya found herself reflecting on the broader implications of what had been discovered. The infiltration network they had identified represented threats that extended far beyond the immediate conference environment, requiring ongoing vigilance and sophisticated response capabilities. Dr. Hayes approached the analysis station as Maya completed the final phase of immediate countermeasure implementation, her expression carrying the relief of someone who had watched a potential catastrophe being transformed into a manageable security incident. "The preliminary results look excellent," Hayes said, her tone carrying genuine admiration for Maya's technical capabilities. "The unauthorized data transmissions have been completely stopped, and our monitoring systems are showing that the malware is being successfully isolated and neutralized." Maya acknowledged the positive results, while maintaining the careful attention to detail that had characterized her work throughout the crisis response. "The immediate threat has been contained," she replied, her voice carrying the measured satisfaction of someone who understood that successful crisis resolution required sustained effort beyond initial countermeasures. "But the broader infiltration network will require ongoing investigation and response operations. What we've discovered here is probably just one component of a much larger intelligence operation." Hawthorne, who had been monitoring the overall response coordination, approached with an expression that reflected both satisfaction with the immediate results and concern about the longer-term implications of what had been discovered. "Ms. Chen," he said, his tone carrying the formality appropriate for official recognition of exceptional service, "your analysis and response capabilities have been essential to preventing what could have been a catastrophic compromise of multiple classified programs." Maya accepted the recognition with the professional grace of someone who understood that successful operations required team efforts and comprehensive support, rather than individual heroics. The real credit belongs to everyone who was willing to set aside initial assumptions and focus on the actual technical evidence, she replied, her tone reflecting genuine appreciation for the collaborative effort that had made the successful response possible. This kind of sophisticated threat requires coordination and expertise from multiple sources. No individual, regardless of their background or capabilities, could have addressed it alone. As the crisis response operations moved into their sustained monitoring and investigation phase, Maya found herself preparing to transition away from direct operational involvement and back to the unofficial intelligence gathering that had originally brought her to the conference. Her mission had been unexpectedly successful, revealing threats that were more extensive and immediate than she had anticipated, but it had also exposed her to levels of official attention that could complicate future operations. Bennett approached Maya as she gathered her materials and prepared to leave the command center, her expression carrying the kind of respect that reflected genuine learning from professional experience. "Ms. Chen," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who wanted to acknowledge important lessons learned, "I want you to know that this experience has fundamentally changed how I think about security assessment and threat evaluation." Maya looked up from her preparations, recognizing that Bennett's statement represented the kind of professional growth that made crisis response operations worthwhile beyond their immediate operational success. "The most important security lesson is learning to trust verified capabilities rather than surface appearances," she replied, her tone carrying the patience of someone who understood the difficulty of changing ingrained professional habits. "It's harder work than making quick judgments, but it's the only way to identify real threats while avoiding the kind of mistakes that let sophisticated adversaries operate undetected." Mitchell joined the conversation, his expression reflecting similar appreciation for the learning opportunities that had emerged from the day's events. "Your point about thinking like attackers is something we'll be incorporating into our training programs," he said, his tone carrying the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered new approaches to familiar challenges. "Understanding how sophisticated threats are designed to exploit our assumptions and procedures gives us better tools for developing effective countermeasures." Maya nodded approvingly, recognizing that Mitchell and Bennett were making the kind of connections between immediate experience and broader professional development that characterized effective security professionals. "The best defense against sophisticated deception is comprehensive verification," she said, her voice carrying the authority of extensive experience with both offensive and defensive operations. "Never assume that initial impressions are accurate, especially when the stakes are high and the opposition is known to be sophisticated." Dr. Hayes, who had been finalizing her own transition from crisis response to ongoing security monitoring, approached with an expression that reflected both professional respect and personal curiosity about Maya's background and methods. "If you don't mind me asking," Hayes said, her tone carrying the interest of someone who appreciated advanced technical expertise, "where do you go from here? Will you be returning to active government service?" Maya considered the question carefully, recognizing that her decision about future operations would need to balance her commitment to protecting national security against the personal and professional costs of returning to official intelligence work. "I'll continue to monitor threats and provide assistance when circumstances require it," she replied, her tone carrying the measured commitment of someone who understood the ongoing nature of security challenges. "But I've learned that some of the most important work can be done from outside official channels, where you have the flexibility to pursue investigations and develop responses that might not be possible within normal bureaucratic constraints." Hawthorne, who had been finalizing coordination with ongoing response operations, joined the group with an expression that reflected both professional satisfaction and personal concern about the implications of Maya's unofficial status. "Ms. Chen," he said, his tone carrying the weight of someone who wanted to ensure that valuable capabilities remained available for future crises, "I hope you understand that your contributions today have demonstrated capabilities that could be essential for addressing emerging threats." Maya recognized that Hawthorne's statement represented both appreciation for her current assistance and an implicit invitation to consider returning to official service, but she also understood the constraints and complications that would accompany such a transition. "I appreciate the recognition," she replied, her voice carrying genuine gratitude mixed with the independence of someone who had chosen her current path for carefully considered reasons. "I'll always be available to provide assistance when genuine threats emerge, but I've found that maintaining some distance from official channels allows me to pursue investigations and develop responses that might not be possible through normal procedures." As the conversation concluded and the various personnel began transitioning to their ongoing responsibilities, Maya found herself reflecting on the unexpected success of her mission and the professional relationships that had developed from what had begun as routine security verification. Her carefully planned infiltration had evolved into active crisis response that had prevented potentially catastrophic intelligence compromises while demonstrating the importance of thorough verification over surface assessment. The transformation in how Bennett, Mitchell, and Hayes viewed her capabilities represented more than just personal recognition. It reflected important lessons about security assessment, threat evaluation, and the dangers of making quick judgments based on appearances rather than verified capabilities. These were lessons that would improve their future professional effectiveness while making them more difficult targets for sophisticated deception operations. Maya gathered her materials and prepared to leave TechSecure corporate headquarters, her mission complete, but her commitment to ongoing security vigilance unchanged. She had successfully identified and helped neutralize a sophisticated intelligence threat, while demonstrating that the most important qualifications were knowledge, capability, and commitment rather than official credentials or impressive appearances. As she walked through the corridors that had initially challenged her presence, Maya reflected on the broader implications of what had been accomplished. The quantum encryption breach had been contained, the broader infiltration network had been identified and was being systematically neutralized, and security professionals throughout the government would be better prepared to identify and respond to sophisticated threats. But perhaps most importantly, the people who had initially dismissed her based on surface appearances had learned valuable lessons about the importance of thorough verification and the dangers of assumptions. These were lessons that would make them more effective security professionals, while making the entire system more resistant to the kind of sophisticated deception that characterized modern intelligence threats. Maya Chen stepped out into the Phoenix afternoon sun, her mission accomplished and her confidence in the importance of substantial expertise over superficial appearances validated once again. She had demonstrated that real security came from verified capabilities rather than impressive credentials, and that the most dangerous oversights often resulted from the assumption that threats would announce themselves rather than carefully concealing their true nature. The conference would continue, but with dramatically improved security awareness and response capabilities. The broader intelligence threat had been identified and was being addressed through coordinated multi-agency operations, and the security professionals who had learned from the day's events would carry those lessons forward to future challenges, making them more effective guardians of national security. In a world where sophisticated adversaries invested enormous resources in developing convincing deceptions, the most important defense remained the willingness to look beyond appearances and verify actual capabilities. Maya had demonstrated that principle once again, proving that substance would always be more important than style when the stakes truly mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.